Hey guys, tonight we're diving into a myth so remarkably unexciting, you might just find yourself drifting off before the first olive branch even appears. Picture this. You're snuggled deep under your covers, the ambient glow of your nightlight, or maybe just the faint light from your neighbor's porch. No judgment here. Casting long, sleepy shadows across your room. Your mind, usually buzzing with the day's last thoughts, is slowly, deliciously emptying. We're about to explore a tale of divine competition, not with thunderous clashes or earth-shattering pronouncements, but with something far more mundane, something that utterly lacks the dramatic flair usually associated with Greek gods. Honestly, you probably won't survive this level of historical blandness without at least one yawn. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, tell me, where in the world are you tuning in from right now, and what time is it for you? Post it in the comments below. I always love seeing how far these sleepy stories travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We're going way, way back, not to the time of mighty heroes battling mythical beasts, but to a quieter, more bureaucratic era in ancient Greece. Imagine a world where fledgling cities, much like startup tech companies today, were seeking investment, divine investment, that is. You see, back then, if you were setting up shop, you didn't just need a good location and a viable business plan. You absolutely required a patron deity. This wasn't some optional spiritual extra. It was a matter of survival, reputation, and often, quite literally, fresh water. These gods and goddesses weren't just figures on temples. They were active participants in mortal affairs, constantly vying for influence, adoration, and, let's be honest, prime real estate in the hearts and wallets of their worshippers. Every city wanted a powerful protector, someone who could bring prosperity, fend off invaders, and maybe even ensure a decent olive harvest. And our story begins with one such city, a prosperous but as yet unnamed settlement perched on a rocky outcrop, yearning for a divine champion. This city, destined for greatness, was at a crossroads. It had a growing population, fertile land, well, as fertile as ancient Greek land gets, which is to say, often quite rocky, and a strategic location overlooking the shimmering Aegean Sea. What it lacked was that crucial divine stamp of approval, that celestial celebrity endorsement that would truly put it on the map. Historians still argue whether the city's initial inhabitants were genuinely seeking spiritual guidance or simply pragmatic benefits. Either way, the call went out. A grand assembly was convened, and a formal invitation was extended to the Olympian pantheon. Think of it as a divine job fair, but with much higher stakes and far more impressive resumes. And like any good job fair, you knew the big players would show up. One quirky tidbit about these city patronage contests is that they often involved a public display of the gods' powers or gifts, almost like a divine product demonstration. It wasn't enough to simply be a god. You had to prove your worth to the mortal populace. This particular contest, however, was designed to be a little different, less about raw power and more about lasting utility. The city elders, a council of wise and probably quite tired individuals, had decided they didn't need flashy fireworks. They needed substance. They needed something that would genuinely improve the lives of their citizens, something sustainable, something that would stand the test of time. And so, the stage was set for a contest that would define a city, and indeed a civilization. As the city waited, a hush fell over the assembled crowd. You can almost feel the anticipation, a quiet hum like a beehive just before swarming season. The air hung heavy with expectation, the salty tang of the sea mingling with the scent of olive groves and the distant murmur of the marketplace. Everyone knew who would answer the call first. When you think of a god making an entrance, you likely imagine something grand, something utterly undeniable. And Poseidon, god of the sea, earthquakes, and horses, never one to do anything subtly, certainly delivered. He strode forward with a swagger that practically made the ground tremble, though, being the god of earthquakes, it might actually have trembled a little, who knows. He certainly wasn't the type to show up in a tweed jacket and sensible shoes. Imagine him now, emerging from the shimmering waters just offshore, his trident clutched in a powerful hand, water still beating on his muscular form. His hair, a wild cascade of blue-green, probably looked like a particularly artistic seaweed sculpture. The sheer force of his presence seemed to push the very air out of your lungs. He was all raw power, all untamed natural might, embodying the crashing waves and the sudden, unpredictable fury of the ocean. He didn't just walk. He dominated the space, his gaze sweeping over the nervous city elders and the awestruck populace. It was a clear statement. I am here and I am significant. This wasn't just a god. This was a force of nature in human, albeit godly, form. Historically, Poseidon was revered and feared by coastal communities throughout Greece, and for good reason. His moods directly impacted their livelihoods. A calm sea meant trade and fishing. A stormy one meant shipwrecks and devastation. So, seeing him arrive in such a majestic, almost intimidating fashion, would have sent shivers down the spines of even the most hardened sailors. One quirky tidbit about Poseidon is that despite being the god of the sea, he was also heavily associated with horses, sometimes even creating them. Historians still argue whether this connection stems from the waves resembling galloping horses or if it's tied to an older, pre-maritime deity. Either way, his arrival on this particular day was pure theatrical genius. He didn't bother with pleasantries, no polite nods or small talk about the weather. He was here to make an impression, and impress he did. The waves at the nearby shore seemed to rise and fall in rhythm with his breath. A powerful, almost primal heartbeat. A slight smile played on his lips, a self-assured grin that said, "You mortals have no idea what's coming, but trust me, it's going to be awesome." He raised his trident, and the crowd collectively held its breath, wondering if he would part the sea, call forth a kraken, or perhaps summon a school of particularly well-behaved dolphins. Whatever it was, you knew it wouldn't be boring. This was the kind of spectacle that made other gods look like they were just trying too hard. Poseidon knew he was the main event, or at least he thought he was. He was the god who brought the drama, the spectacle, the kind of grand gesture that would make mortals talk for generations. And for a city seeking a patron, a god who could command such awe and power certainly seemed like a strong contender. But then again, as you're about to find out, sometimes the flashiest display isn't always the most practical. With Poseidon still basking in his magnificent, if slightly damp, glory, the crowd barely had time to exhale before another figure made her appearance. This wasn't a thunderous arrival, no parting of waters or dramatic flourishes. Instead, Athena entered with a quiet dignity, a subtle shift in the atmosphere rather than a seismic event. You wouldn't have noticed her at first if you were still gawking at the receding tide from Poseidon's entrance, or perhaps wiping a stray drop of sea spray from your brow. But then, almost imperceptibly, your attention would have been drawn to her. She didn't stride or swagger. She simply moved, with an almost imperceptible grace. There was no theatricality, no need for flashy displays. Her very presence commanded respect, a cool, calm intelligence radiating from her. Dressed in her customary aegis, not as a warlike statement, but as a symbol of protection and wisdom, she carried herself with an air of absolute certainty. Her helmet, often depicted with a menacing Gorgon head, was probably understated today, perhaps just a simple, elegant crest. You might have even thought, for a fleeting moment, that she was just another one of the city's esteemed elders, albeit a remarkably composed and beautiful one. Contrast this with Poseidon's boisterous energy. While he was all about raw, untamed nature, Athena was the embodiment of cultivated thought, strategic planning, and the steady hand of civilization. She represented the mind over brute force, the carefully plotted siege over the chaotic charge. Historically, Athena was considered one of the most respected and influential deities in the Greek pantheon, not just for her prowess in warfare, which was considerable, but for her wisdom, her patronage of crafts, and her role in guiding heroes. She was the goddess who helped Odysseus find his way home, not by smashing obstacles, but by offering clever counsel and subtle interventions. One quirky tidbit about Athena is that despite being the goddess of wisdom and strategic warfare, she was also the patroness of weaving and handicrafts. This seemingly disparate set of responsibilities actually highlights her practical, intellectual nature. It takes immense skill and planning to weave intricate tapestries, much like it does to strategize a successful battle. Historians still argue whether her association with crafts predates or developed concurrently with her martial aspects, suggesting a deep-seated connection between creation and disciplined thought in Greek culture. She observed the scene before her with keen, intelligent eyes. Her gaze wasn't boastful or challenging, but analytical. You could almost see the gears turning in her mind, assessing the crowd's reactions to Poseidon, calculating the optimal approach for her own presentation. There was no rush, no hint of impatience. She understood that true influence wasn't about the loudest roar, but about the most enduring impact. She wasn't trying to outshow Poseidon. She was operating on an entirely different level of competition. She knew what this city truly needed, and it wasn't another impressive display of elemental power. It was something deeper, something foundational, something that would contribute to sustained growth and prosperity. Her quiet confidence was, in its own way, far more intimidating than Poseidon's bluster. It was the confidence of someone who knows they hold the winning hand, even if the other player is still busy counting their chips. With both mighty contenders now present, the air crackled with a different kind of energy, less the raw power of Poseidon, more the collective anticipation of a town meeting where everyone knows something big is about to be decided. The city's elders, a group of weathered men and women who probably spent most of their days debating grain prices and fishing quotas, now faced the unenviable task of presiding over a divine beauty pageant. You can almost feel their discomfort. Imagine trying to tell a god, especially one who could summon tsunamis, that their gift wasn't quite up to par. These elders, however, were shrewd. They understood the practicalities of their burgeoning city. They weren't looking for flashy displays of cosmic might, the sort of thing that makes for great dinner party stories but doesn't actually feed anyone. No, they were looking for a patron who would bring tangible, lasting benefits. So, they laid out the ground rules with a solemnity befitting the occasion, their voices echoing slightly in the open-air assembly. The competition, they declared, would not be about who was strongest or prettiest, or even who could conjure the most impressive mythological creature. It was about utility. It was about enduring value. The god, one elder, perhaps named Theron, with a long gray beard and an even longer gaze, intoned, "Who offers the most beneficial gift to our city, a gift that will truly sustain and enrich the lives of our people for generations to come, shall be our patron." You can almost hear the unstated subtext, "No giant squid, please. We have enough trouble with the regular ones." This wasn't a contest of ego, at least not for the mortals. For the gods, it was absolutely a contest of ego, thinly veiled as philanthropy. Historically, The concept of a city's patron deity was fundamental to ancient Greek urban identity. Just as modern cities might identify with a particular industry or famous landmark, Greek cities were intrinsically linked to their divine protectors. Athens had Athena, Sparta had Ares, and so on. This wasn't just symbolic. The gods' influence was believed to directly impact the city's prosperity and security. One quirky tidbit is that these competitions sometimes involved other deities as judges or witnesses, adding another layer of political intrigue to the divine drama. Historians still argue whether the outcomes of these myths truly reflected pre-existing religious affiliations or were later narratives constructed to explain why certain gods were worshipped in specific places. The rules were clear. Each deity would present a single gift. No do-overs, no, actually, I also brought this other thing. It had to be something practical, something that would provide a real advantage to a city trying to establish itself in a competitive ancient world. Think of it like a divine dragon's den, but instead of pitching a business idea, you're pitching a miracle, and the dragons are extremely powerful beings with complicated family dynamics. The citizens, gathered around, murmured amongst themselves. What could a god possibly offer that would be more useful than, say, infinite gold or eternal youth? The elders knew. They needed water, fertile land, protection, trade routes, the mundane, essential elements of survival. They needed a divine gift that wasn't just a showpiece, but a cornerstone. And with the rules established, the stage was now truly set for the divine presentations. The moment had arrived. The stage was set, the rules were clear, and the anticipation was palpable, like the hush before a critical dice roll in a high-stakes game. All eyes, mortal and immortal alike, turned to Poseidon. He had, after all, made the most dramatic entrance, so it only seemed right that he go first. You could almost hear him clear his throat, though being a god, it was probably more of a low rumble, like distant thunder or a particularly active whale. He exuded an aura of confidence, the kind that comes from knowing you're incredibly powerful and generally get what you want. With a flourish that was both theatrical and genuinely impressive, Poseidon lifted his trident. It wasn't merely a fishing spear. This was a symbol of his dominion, a three-pronged scepter capable of stirring oceans and splitting mountains. He aimed it at the rocky ground near the assembled crowd, specifically at a spot that looked stubbornly dry and inhospitable. There was a collective gasp as the tip of the trident struck the earth with a resounding crack. From the newly formed fissure, water immediately began to gush forth. Not a gentle trickle, mind you, but a powerful torrent, surging upwards like a geyser, and then cascading down into a rapidly forming pool. The sound of the rushing water filled the air, drowning out the murmurs of the crowd. A powerful, undeniable display of raw, elemental force. This was the sort of miracle that could quench the thirst of a parched land, ensure crops grew, and sustain a population. It was, without a doubt, a magnificent gift. Historically, access to fresh water was a constant struggle for ancient Greek cities, especially those, like Athens, built on relatively arid terrain. Springs were vital, and the ability to control or create water sources was seen as a truly divine power. So, Poseidon's gift wasn't just flashy. It addressed a fundamental life-or-death need. One quirky tidbit about this specific gift is that while it seemed perfect, there was a catch, a detail that, perhaps, only a truly discerning palate would immediately notice. Historians still argue whether Poseidon intended the flaw, or if it was an oversight born of his sheer power and perhaps a touch of divine hubris. The crowd erupted in cheers, a mixture of awe and relief. Who wouldn't want a god who could simply conjure water from barren rock? Imagine the immediate benefits. No more hauling water from distant wells, no more anxieties about drought. The promise of lush fields where before there was only scrub. Children probably rushed forward, eager to touch the newly sprung water, quickly pulling their hands back with surprised expressions. The elders, however, were perhaps a little more circumspect. They approached the surging spring, their expressions a mix of gratitude and critical assessment. One elder, probably the same Theron from before, cupped a hand in the water and brought it to his lips. His brow furrowed. The initial rush of excitement began to subside as a new, subtle understanding dawned. The water, while abundant, had a distinct taste, a salty taste. It was seawater, not fresh. Poseidon, in his magnificent haste and boundless power, had gifted them the very thing they were surrounded by, yet could not drink. It was a potent reminder that not all gifts, even from a god, are created equal, and sometimes the most obvious solution isn't the most practical. The initial roar of appreciation quickly died down, replaced by a confused murmur that rippled through the crowd like a faulty echo. You could see it on their faces. First the awe, then the hopeful anticipation as the water gushed forth, and finally, the slow, dawning realization that something was off. Imagine that moment of communal disappointment, a deflating balloon of excitement. The children who had rushed forward to splash in the miraculous spring now recoiled, their eager smiles twisting into grimaces. The elders, those pragmatic souls, were already tasting the truth, their expressions a mix of polite dismay and resigned understanding. "It's salty," someone whispered, the words spreading like wildfire through the ranks of the assembled citizens. "It's seawater." A collective groan, soft at first, then growing louder, rose from the populace. It was the sound of a grand promise dissolving into a practical problem. While the sheer power of Poseidon's gift was undeniable, its utility was, shall we say, significantly diminished. What good was an endless supply of water if it couldn't sustain life, if it couldn't be drunk, or used to irrigate crops without poisoning the soil? Historically, the problem of fresh water scarcity was paramount for many ancient Greek cities, and saltwater intrusion into freshwater sources was a very real, very devastating issue. This was not just a minor inconvenience. It was a fundamental flaw that rendered Poseidon's magnificent display virtually useless for the city's primary needs. One quirky tidbit about this myth is that some versions suggest Poseidon created a freshwater spring that was then made salty by Athena's subtle intervention or another divine trick. But the more popular and, frankly, funnier version emphasizes his oversight. Historians still argue whether this detail was purely symbolic, highlighting the contrast between the gods, or if it reflected actual geological challenges of the Attic landscape. Poseidon, for his part, seemed oblivious to the growing disquiet. He stood there, chest puffed out, trident still gleaming, clearly expecting universal adulation. He was probably thinking, "See, I made water, unlimited water. Bow before my watery might." He just didn't quite grasp the concept of potable. It's like being given a brand new, incredibly fast chariot, only to find out it runs on tears of disappointment and unicorn dust. Impressive, but utterly impractical. The irony was thick. The god of the sea had given them a gift of the sea, right next to the sea. It was redundant, a magnificent redundancy. The city elders exchanged weary glances. Theron, the chief elder, stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Lord Poseidon," he began, his voice carefully neutral, "we are profoundly grateful for your immense power, displayed so brilliantly before us. This spring is indeed a testament to your might." He paused, choosing his words with diplomatic precision. "However, our people require water that sustains, water that nourishes our crops and quenches our thirst." He didn't need to explicitly say it was salty. The message was clear. It was the ancient Greek equivalent of, "Thank you for the thought." But no, the crowd's reaction was a complex tapestry of emotions. There was still a residual awe for the sheer spectacle, a faint whisper of, "Wow, a god just made a spring." But overriding it was the stark reality of their daily lives. They didn't need a grand gesture. They needed a practical solution. And Poseidon's gift, for all its power, simply didn't fit the bill. The stage was now open for the next contender, and the bar, in terms of sheer, blinding spectacle, was set incredibly high. But in terms of actual, useful benefit, not so much. With Poseidon's magnificent, yet utterly unhelpful, display fading into a salty memory, the atmosphere shifted once more. The air, previously charged with the raw energy of a sea god's dramatic entry, now held a quieter, more thoughtful hum. All eyes, which had been riveted on the gushing, undrinkable spring, now turned expectantly towards Athena. She had patiently observed Poseidon's performance and the subsequent disappointed reactions of the populace. A slight, almost imperceptible curve on her lips suggesting she had anticipated precisely this outcome. You might have even caught a faint twinkle in her intelligent eyes, the kind that says, "Oh, bless his heart, he really tried." She didn't rush. There was no need for grandstanding, no theatrical gestures. Her confidence was not a loud pronouncement but a deep, inherent knowledge of what was truly valuable. This was not a contest of brute force or showmanship, but of true utility, and Athena, goddess of wisdom and strategic warfare, understood utility better than anyone. She approached the spot where Poseidon had struck his trident, not with a flourish, but with a deliberate, measured pace. Her movements were precise, efficient, embodying the very essence of thoughtful action. Historically, Athena's foresight and strategic thinking were her defining characteristics. Unlike other gods who might act on impulse or emotion, Athena consistently demonstrated a capacity for long-term planning and understanding of consequences. This careful approach was evident in her patronage of heroes like Odysseus, whom she guided with cunning plans rather than raw power. One quirky tidbit about Athena is that she was sometimes associated with the owl, a nocturnal bird known for its keen eyesight and silent hunting, symbolizing her wisdom and ability to perceive hidden truths. Historians still argue whether the owl association predates or follows the establishment of her cult in Athens. She held in her hand not a flashy weapon or a glittering artifact, but something far more humble. It looked, to the casual observer, like nothing more than a simple, slender branch. It wasn't adorned with jewels, nor did it pulse with divine energy. It was, in fact, just a plain, unassuming twig. And yet, there was an unmistakable aura of potential about it, a quiet strength that whispered of deeper meaning. The citizens, weary from the earlier roller coaster of expectation and disappointment, watched with a cautious curiosity. What could a mere stick possibly offer their burgeoning city? Had this wise goddess perhaps misinterpreted the competition? Athena knelt down, her movements fluid and graceful, and gently placed the branch into the still damp earth where Poseidon's salty spring had flowed. There was no theatrical crack, no gushing water. Instead, something far more subtle, yet profoundly powerful, began to happen. The branch almost immediately began to sprout, not rapidly, like some cheap parlor trick, but with the steady, undeniable growth of something truly alive and deeply rooted. Tiny green leaves unfurled, almost imperceptibly at first, then growing more distinct. Slender roots began to push into the soil, seeking purchase, drawing sustenance from the earth itself. A murmur went through the crowd, different this time. It wasn't awe at a sudden, overwhelming display of power, but a quiet, dawning understanding of something profound. This wasn't a temporary gush. This was life taking root, promising enduring growth. This was a seed of future prosperity, not a fleeting miracle. You could almost feel the collective intake of breath as the true nature of her gift began to manifest, slowly, deliberately, and with an undeniable air of quiet triumph. The stage was set, not for another grand display, but for a revelation of true, lasting value. As Athena's humble branch took root, the subtle miracle unfolded before the eyes of the assembled citizens. This wasn't a sudden, blinding flash or a thunderous crash. It was a gentle unfurling, a quiet persistence that spoke volumes without uttering a single sound. The slender twig, planted so carefully into the earth, now visibly thickened, its bark deepening in color. From its nascent branches, delicate green leaves, almost impossibly vibrant, began to unfurl, reaching towards the warm Greek sun. You could almost hear the collective murmur of wonder, a sound entirely different from the earlier gasp of awe at Poseidon's spectacle. This was a quiet awe born of understanding. What was emerging from the soil was unmistakably an olive tree. Not a sapling, but a rapidly maturing tree, its trunk gaining girth, its branches spreading with an almost purposeful grace. Within moments, what had been a mere stick transformed into a sturdy young tree, its leaves a soft, silvery green, rustling gently in the sea breeze. And then, as if by magic or perhaps just the sheer, effortless power of a goddess, small green fruits began to appear, nestled amongst the leaves. They were the unmistakable promise of harvest, of sustenance, of lasting prosperity. Historically, the olive tree was not just a plant. It was the bedrock of ancient Mediterranean civilization. It provided food, yes, but also oil for lamps, for cooking, for anointing bodies, and even for trade. It was a symbol of peace, wisdom, and abundance. Unlike the fickle sea, which could bring both bounty and destruction, the olive tree was a steady, reliable provider. Its longevity meant it could nourish generations from a single planting. One quirky tidbit is that the olive tree can live for hundreds, even thousands of years. Some trees in the Mediterranean are reputedly over 2,000 years old, still bearing fruit today. Historians still argue about the exact origins of olive cultivation, but its centrality to Greek life is undeniable. The citizens, no longer blinded by the immediate splashiness of Poseidon's gift, now gazed upon Athena's offering with a growing sense of understanding and admiration. They saw not just a tree, but a future. They saw sustenance that didn't rely on the caprice of the gods or the dangers of the sea. They saw oil for their lamps, allowing them to work and study into the night, extending the hours of productivity. They saw food, not just for immediate hunger, but for preservation, for trade, for wealth creation. They saw a resource that would bind their community together, requiring careful cultivation, patient tending, and collective effort. Imagine the discussions that immediately began to ripple through the crowd. Oil for lamps, someone might have whispered, thinking of the long, dark nights. Food for our children, another would add, envisioning endless jars of olives. And for trade, a merchant would exclaim, already calculating the potential profits. This wasn't just a gift. It was an entire economic system, a sustainable way of life wrapped in a single, unassuming tree. It was the epitome of practical wisdom, a solution to real, everyday problems rather than an overwhelming, but ultimately useless, display of divine might. Athena had understood precisely what the elders had asked for, not the most impressive gift, but the most beneficial. And in the quiet, rustling leaves of the olive tree, she had delivered just that. With both divine gifts laid bare, the gushing, salty spring of Poseidon and the quietly flourishing olive tree of Athena. The responsibility for choosing now fell squarely upon the city's elders. You can practically see them, their brows furrowed in concentration, their wise, weathered faces reflecting the weight of their decision. This wasn't just about picking a favorite. It was about the very future of their burgeoning city. They retired to deliberate, likely retreating to a shaded, quiet courtyard, away from the murmurs of the expectant crowd and the subtle, lingering presence of the gods. Imagine the scene. A circle of grave, dignified individuals, perhaps sitting on stone benches, their staffs resting beside them. The chief elder, Theron, would no doubt lead the discussion, meticulously laying out the pros and cons of each offering. On one hand, Poseidon's gift was an astonishing feat of raw power. It proved he could provide water, even if it was undrinkable. His patronage might mean protection from naval attacks or calm seas for trade. He was a force to be reckoned with, and displeasing him could invite the wrath of earthquakes and storms. The weight of his potential fury was not lost on them. But then there was Athena's gift, the olive tree. It wasn't flashy. It didn't gush or thunder. Yet its implications were profound. It offered not just food, but a multi-purpose resource: oil for lamps, fuel, medicine, and most importantly, a valuable commodity for trade. It was a symbol of peace and prosperity, requiring cultivation and care, rather than simply appearing from the earth. It represented a sustainable future, built on hard work and thoughtful management, rather than instant, potentially problematic miracles. Historically, such deliberations were common in the ancient world, whether for choosing allies, trade routes, or indeed patron deities. Decisions were often made by consensus among a council of elders or citizens, reflecting the nascent democratic ideals emerging in some Greek city-states. One quirky tidbit is that in some accounts, the elders were also influenced by the opinions of their wives, as women were the primary users of olive oil for cooking and household needs, giving them a practical voice in the matter. Historians still argue whether the story of the saltiness of Poseidon's spring was a later addition to justify Athena's victory, or if it was an integral part of the original myth, highlighting the practical challenges of coastal living. The debate would have been earnest, perhaps even heated at times, but always grounded in the practical needs of their people. "We need water to drink," one elder might have exclaimed, gesturing towards the sea. "But what good is salty water?" Another would counter, perhaps rubbing his stomach. "Poseidon's power is immense." A third would argue, "We risk his wrath if we choose against him. But Athena offers stability, sustenance, and trade for generations." A fourth would insist, holding up an imaginary olive. It wasn't a simple choice between good and bad, but between different kinds of good, with very real consequences attached to each. They were weighing immediate awe against enduring benefit, raw power against strategic wisdom. And as the hours stretched on, the fate of the city hung in the balance, resting on the collective wisdom of these few, earnest individuals. The citizens outside waited, their murmurs growing quieter as the weight of the decision settled over the gathering. While the elders huddled in their secluded council, the greater body of citizens remained outside, their murmurs growing from a quiet hum to a restless buzz. The choice facing their leaders was, in a very real sense, their own choice too, and the city was rapidly dividing into two distinct factions. You could almost draw an invisible line in the dusty square, separating the fervent supporters of Poseidon from the earnest advocates for Athena. It was like a very ancient, very important political rally, but instead of campaign slogans, people were shouting about salt content and lamp oil. On one side, you had the Poseidon Pride contingent. These were probably the fishermen, the sailors, and anyone who lived by the unpredictable rhythms of the sea. They understood raw power, the overwhelming might of the ocean. For them, Poseidon's ability to conjure water, even if salty, was a testament to his sheer, undeniable strength. "He commands the waves," they would shout, their voices hoarse with conviction. "He protects our ships. His wrath is terrible, his favor invaluable." They might even point to the sheer spectacle of his gift, arguing that such a powerful deity would bring immense prestige to their city. After all, who would dare attack a city protected by the god of earthquakes and tsunamis? They probably envisioned a future of unchallenged naval dominance, their merchant ships sailing safely across the Aegean, plundering trade routes, or, just trading fairly but with a lot of swagger. On the other side stood the olive optimists, the supporters of Athena. These were likely the farmers, the artisans, the weavers, and the more pragmatic members of the community. They understood the value of hard work, sustainable resources, and a stable economy. "What good is salty water for our crops?" they'd retort, gesturing towards the fields. "Athena offers food, oil, and trade. She brings wisdom and crafts, not just raw power." They would highlight the longevity of the olive tree, its continuous yield, and its versatile uses. Imagine a farmer, perhaps with calloused hands and dirt beneath his fingernails, passionately explaining the sheer economic power of olive oil in ancient Greece. It wasn't just for eating. It was currency, lubricant, fuel for light, and even the base for early soaps and perfumes. Historically, this kind of public deliberation and division was a hallmark of burgeoning Greek democracy. Citizens had a say, even if indirectly, in matters of profound civic importance. This informal polling of public sentiment would have been crucial for the elders to gauge the popular will. One quirky tidbit is that in some accounts, the male citizens favored Poseidon, while the female citizens, valuing the practical uses of olive oil for household needs and cooking, leaned towards Athena, essentially splitting the vote along gender lines. Historians still argue whether this gendered division truly reflects ancient Greek societal roles, or is a narrative device to emphasize the different forms of utility offered by each god. The air was thick with debate, passionate arguments echoing through the city square. Fingers were pointed, voices were raised, but beneath the fervor, there was a genuine desire for the best outcome for their home. Each side truly believed their chosen deity offered the superior path to prosperity and security. The Poseidon pride envisioned a city of maritime might, feared by its enemies and respected for its powerful patron. The olive optimists dreamt of a self-sufficient, wise, and prosperous city, its economy rooted in the rich bounty of the land, its people enlightened by the very symbol of wisdom. The elders, cloistered away, were acutely aware of these very vocal divisions. Their decision would not only pick a patron but also implicitly endorse a vision for the city's future, a future that currently hung balanced precariously on the scales of divine gifts. As the city remained locked in a heated debate, waiting for the elders' verdict, whispers began to ripple through the crowd. These weren't just the ordinary murmurs of public opinion, but something more subtle, more insidious. Tales of divine intervention, not from the competing gods themselves, but from other members of the Olympian pantheon, began to circulate. You see, the gods were a notoriously gossipy and meddlesome bunch, and a competition for a new city's patronage was a prime opportunity for them to exert influence, settle old scores, or simply stir the pot for amusement. Imagine a group of farmers gathered near the olive tree, discussing its merits, when one of them leans in, lowering his voice. "I heard from my cousin, who sailed to Delphi," he might begin, "that Apollo himself has been seen speaking to Elder Theron in his dreams, praising the wisdom of slow growth. Meanwhile, over by the salty spring, A sailor might be recounting how Hermes, the messenger god, was spotted flitting amongst the council members, subtly nudging them towards the might makes right philosophy that Poseidon embodied. This wasn't necessarily overt meddling, like Zeus throwing a lightning bolt to influence a vote. It was more about subtle nudges, quiet suggestions whispered into the minds of mortals, or perhaps even appearing in dreams. The gods had their own favorites, their own biases, and their own intricate web of alliances and rivalries. A win for Athena might displease Ares, for example, or a triumph for Poseidon might irk Hera. The stakes, for the gods, were as much about prestige and bragging rights within their divine family as they were about gaining a new city of worshippers. Historically, the Greek pantheon was depicted as a sprawling, dysfunctional family, constantly interfering in mortal affairs for both grand and petty reasons. These divine influences, whether real or imagined by the mortals, played a significant role in how events unfolded and how myths were interpreted. One quirky tidbit is that some myths suggest that even the fates, those mysterious weavers of destiny, might occasionally drop a hint or two, just to keep things interesting, though they rarely took direct sides. Historians still argue whether the concept of divine intervention in everyday life was a genuine belief held by all Greeks or a narrative tool used by poets to explain human triumphs and tragedies. These rumors of divine, whispering campaigns only heightened the tension among the citizens. It added another layer of complexity to an already fraught decision. If even the gods couldn't agree, how could mere mortals hope to choose correctly? It introduced a sense of cosmic uncertainty, a feeling that perhaps the outcome was already predetermined by forces beyond their comprehension. You could see the subtle shifts in people's arguments. Some who had been staunchly pro-Poseidon might suddenly waffle, wondering if they were going against the silent wishes of another powerful god. Conversely, those favoring Athena might feel emboldened, believing their choice was divinely sanctioned by the wisest of the gods. The elders, isolated in their deliberation chamber, were likely experiencing these very same whispers, or at least the gnawing doubt that came from trying to discern a godly will amidst their own earthly concerns. The air in the city square was thick with this unseen influence, a pervasive sense that more than just two deities were invested in the outcome. It made the impending decision not just a civic matter, but a cosmic one, with unseen forces subtly pulling at the threads of their destiny. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, the tension in the city square became almost unbearable. The whispers had subsided into a nervous silence, punctuated only by the distant bleating of goats or the gentle lapping of waves against the shore. Everyone knew the moment of truth was imminent. The elders, having weighed the tangible and the intangible, the practical and the powerful, the overt and the subtly influenced, were finally ready to announce their decision. You could feel the collective intake of breath, a city holding its breath as one, poised on the precipice of its defining moment. Imagine the chief elder, Theron, emerging from the council chambers, his face etched with the solemnity of the decision. He probably walked with a slow, deliberate pace, his eyes scanning the expectant faces of his people, then flicking, almost imperceptibly, towards the waiting figures of Poseidon and Athena. One was still radiating immense, if slightly annoyed, power. The other a quiet, almost serene wisdom. The contrast between them was stark, and the choice would reflect the very character of the city to come. A single, resonant drumbeat echoed across the square, a signal that the announcement was about to be made. The crowd, which had been buzzing with speculation just moments before, now fell into a complete, reverent hush. This wasn't just about a name or a gift. It was about their identity, their survival, their future. Which divine hand would guide their destiny? Would they be a city of maritime strength, perhaps prone to dramatic shifts like the sea itself? Or would they be a city of enduring wisdom, cultivation, and peaceful prosperity? Historically, the process of voting and public announcement was a critical ritual in many Greek city-states, reinforcing civic identity and the participation, at least in theory, of the populace. The method of voting often varied, from raising hands to dropping pebbles into urns, each designed to ensure a fair, or perceived as fair, outcome. One quirky tidbit about this particular mythical vote is that some versions imply the female citizens had a decisive say, swaying the outcome with their practical preference for Athena's olive tree. Historians still argue whether this detail suggests a greater, albeit often unrecorded, influence of women in early Athenian society, or if it's a later addition to the myth to explain the city's character. You could feel the weight of history in that moment, the sense that every single person present, every stone underfoot, every breath taken, was part of something monumental. Poseidon stood tall, his expression unreadable, though you might detect a faint ripple in the nearby salty spring, as if even the water held its breath. Athena, ever calm, ever composed, stood quietly by her nascent olive tree, its leaves gently rustling as if in quiet anticipation. She knew, deep down, that her gift, though less flashy, held the true promise for this fledgling city. The dramatic tension was almost unbearable. Who would they choose? The god of raw, untamed power, or the goddess of cultivated wisdom and enduring life? The answer was about to be revealed, and with it, the course of one of the most famous cities in TH. The ancient world would be irrevocably set. The air hung heavy, thick with the weight of the moment. You could hear the distant cry of a seagull, a mournful sound that seemed to punctuate the silence. Every eye was fixed on Elder Theron as he took a deep, resonant breath. His gaze swept over the crowd, a solemn acknowledgement of the immense responsibility resting on his shoulders. Then, his voice, clear and unwavering, finally broke the silence. "Citizens of this noble city," he began, his words carrying across the square. "We, your elders, have deliberated long and with great care. We have considered the magnificent displays of both mighty Poseidon and wise Athena. We have weighed the gifts, listened to the arguments, and sought the truest path for our collective future." He paused, letting the words sink in, building the suspense to an almost unbearable peak. Then, his voice gaining a quiet but firm resolve, he delivered the verdict. "And by the will of the people, and the judgment of this council, we choose Athena." A wave of sound washed over the square. It wasn't a unanimous roar, but a complex tapestry of reactions. From the olive optimists, a cheer erupted, a joyous, triumphant sound that spoke of vindication and hope. You could see people embracing, tears in their eyes, envisioning a future of prosperity and peace under Athena's guidance. Their cheers were quickly joined by the appreciative rustling of the olive tree's leaves, as if the tree itself was applauding its patroness. On the other side, among the Poseidon pride, a palpable sense of disappointment settled. There were groans, muttered curses, and perhaps even a few angry shouts. Their faces mirrored a blend of frustration and disbelief. Their mighty god, the master of the seas, had been passed over for a goddess who offered a tree. It probably felt like a slight, a personal affront to their chosen champion. Imagine a football stadium after a heartbreaking last-minute loss. That was the vibe in their section. Historically, while this myth typically portrays the choice as a clear victory for wisdom over raw power, the decision would have been genuinely contentious in the nascent stages of Athenian identity. The importance of the sea to Greek trade and defense meant Poseidon was a highly respected, almost essential, deity. One quirky tidbit from later accounts suggests that after the vote, Poseidon, in his fury, sent a great flood to engulf the Athenian plain as retribution, though this detail is often omitted from the boring versions of the myth. Historians still argue whether this myth truly represents a historical contest or serves as an ideological tale explaining why Athens, despite being a major naval power, ultimately chose Athena as its primary patron. Athena, for her part, remained serenely composed. No grand gesture, no triumphant smirk, just a subtle nod, a quiet acknowledgement of the honor bestowed upon her. Her gaze, however, lingered for a moment on Poseidon, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes, perhaps a touch of empathy, or simply the quiet satisfaction of a strategist whose plan has come to fruition. Her victory was not one of conquest, but of demonstrated value. She had won not by overwhelming force, but by offering something truly beneficial, something that resonated deeply with the practical needs and aspirations of the mortals. And Poseidon? He stood, trident still in hand, his powerful frame tensing. His face, usually a storm of emotion, seemed to freeze. You could almost hear the grinding of his teeth, a sound that might have been mistaken for distant thunder. He was clearly displeased, immensely so, to be outmaneuvered, not in battle, but in a contest of gifts, by his niece no less, was surely a bitter pill to swallow. The city had made its choice, and in that decision, it had defined its character, forever linking its destiny to the wise, enduring spirit of Athena and her unassuming, yet infinitely valuable olive tree. A palpable tension still hung in the air, a faint aftershock of the momentous decision. While Athena stood serene in her quiet triumph, all eyes, both mortal and divine, now shifted to Poseidon. You could almost feel the raw, untamed power radiating from him, like the heat from a forge. To say he was displeased would be an understatement of epic proportions, akin to saying the ocean is a bit wet. This was the god who commanded the very foundations of the earth, who could conjure storms and shatter mountains with a flick of his wrist. And he had just been politely but firmly rejected by a group of mortals in favor of an olive tree. His face, normally a stormy expanse of blue-green eyes and wild hair, darkened further. His jaw was clenched, and the muscles in his arms, gripping his trident, visibly tensed. For a moment, you might have worried that the entire rocky outcrop on which the city stood would simply crumble into the sea. There was a low rumble, not from the earth, but from deep within his chest, like a distant, approaching thunderstorm. This was the pride of an immensely powerful being, bruised and insulted. Yet, despite the palpable fury emanating from him, something remarkable happened. He didn't unleash a devastating tsunami. He didn't cause the ground to split open and swallow the offending elders. He didn't even turn the chief elder into a particularly salty fish. Instead, with a visible effort that seemed to cost him dearly, Poseidon took a deep, shuddering breath. He lowered his trident, its formidable prongs now merely resting on the ground, rather than threatening to pierce it. His shoulders, which had been hunched in anger, slowly relaxed. This wasn't an act of joy or even genuine acceptance. It was a grudging, almost painful concession. He acknowledged the outcome. He didn't like it, not one bit, but he accepted it. Perhaps it was the presence of Zeus, or some other higher divine authority, implied but unseen, that held his temper in check. Or perhaps, deep down, even Poseidon recognized the validity of the city's choice, however much it rankled his divine ego. It was the ancient Greek equivalent of a sore loser shaking the winner's hand, but doing so with a grip so firm it might just crush a few bones. Historically, while Greek gods were often depicted as volatile and prone to fits of pique, They also understood the established order of the cosmos and the limits of their individual authority, especially when a decision had been made through a legitimate, even if mortal, process. One quirky tidbit is that in some local cults, the city still offered sacrifices to Poseidon alongside Athena, a way of appeasing the powerful sea god and preventing his potential wrath, effectively hedging their bets. Historians still argue whether the grudging concession of Poseidon in this myth highlights the growing emphasis on civic order and reasoned choice over brute divine force in Athenian self-perception, or if it simply serves to emphasize Athena's superior wisdom without making Poseidon appear entirely petty. He did not offer congratulations. He did not smile. He simply nodded curtly, a sharp, abrupt motion that conveyed a world of unvoiced displeasure. Then, with one last, lingering glare at the flourishing olive tree, as if it were the source of all his current woes, he turned and walked back towards the sea. The waves, which had been somewhat agitated by his fury, seemed to calm slightly in his wake, still reflecting his mood but no longer in turmoil. He disappeared beneath the shimmering surface, leaving behind not destruction, but merely the salty tang of disappointment in the air. The city had chosen its patron, and while Athena celebrated her quiet victory, Poseidon retreated, his powerful spirit surely brooding beneath the waves. The peace was fragile, but for now it held. With the divine competition concluded and Poseidon's grumpy departure, the city could finally exhale. You could almost feel the collective sigh of relief sweep through the populace, a tension that had been building for hours now finally dissipating. The decision had been made, and the path forward was clear. The first act of the newly chosen patroness was, fittingly, to give the city its enduring identity. Athena, ever the pragmatist, stepped forward, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to the divine drama that had just unfolded. She looked upon the city, the bustling marketplace, the hopeful faces of the citizens, and then to the flourishing olive tree, now a symbol of her wise choice. With a simple yet profound gesture, she bestowed upon the city its new name. From this day forth, her voice resonated, not with thunder, but with clear authority. You shall be called Athens. The sound of the name, Athens, echoed across the square. It was a name that would, for millennia, be synonymous with wisdom, democracy, philosophy, and art. The citizens cheered, their voices now unified in celebration. No longer would they be that unnamed city by the sea, but a place with a distinct identity, linked intrinsically to their chosen goddess. The renaming wasn't just symbolic. It was a foundational act, establishing a shared identity and a collective destiny. Historically, the naming of a city after its patron deity was a common practice in ancient Greece, solidifying the divine civic bond. Athens, of course, became one of the most powerful and influential city-states, a cultural and intellectual beacon. One quirky tidbit is that while the city was named after Athena, the original pre-Greek name of the Acropolis, the rocky hill where the city was built, was likely Cecropia, after its mythical first king, Cecrops. Historians still argue whether the dominance of Athena's cult in Athens gradually led to the city's renaming, or if the myth of the contest specifically served to justify an existing name and its associated patronage. Immediately, the process of formalizing Athena's patronage began. You could imagine the city elders, invigorated by the clarity of their decision, setting about constructing grand temples in her honor. The Parthenon, that magnificent symbol of classical Greek architecture, would eventually rise on the Acropolis, a testament to this very moment. But even before the grand structures, smaller altars would be erected, rituals established, and festivals planned, all dedicated to their wise patroness. Her symbols, the owl, the olive branch, the aegis, would begin to appear on coinage, pottery, and public buildings, weaving her presence into the very fabric of daily life. The olive tree, Athena's gift, now became more than just a plant. It was a sacred icon. It would be carefully tended, its fruit harvested with reverence, its oil cherished. The very presence of the tree would serve as a constant, gentle reminder of Athena's wisdom and the kind of prosperity that grows from careful cultivation and strategic foresight, rather than mere brute force. The city had forged its legacy, not through a dramatic battle or an overwhelming display of power, but through a pragmatic choice that prioritized lasting utility and intellectual prowess. Athens, with Athena as its guiding star, was now poised to become a cradle of civilization, a beacon of thought and progress, all thanks to a pottery contest won without the goddess lifting a single finger, just a branch. The naming of the city and the formal establishment of Athena's patronage marked a new chapter, but her unassuming gift, the olive tree, continued to unfold its quiet significance. You see, this wasn't just a one-time offering. It was a living, breathing symbol, its roots deepening into the very identity of Athens. Imagine, centuries later, walking through the sun-drenched Attic landscape, and everywhere you look, there are olive groves, their gnarled trunks testament to their age, their silvery leaves shimmering in the breeze. Each tree, in its silent way, whispers the story of Athena's wisdom. The olive tree became more than just a source of sustenance. It became a pervasive cultural icon. Its oil, as you might recall, was incredibly versatile. It fueled lamps, casting warm light on scholars as they debated philosophy late into the night. It nourished bodies, used in cooking and as a base for perfumes and medicines. It even played a significant role in athletic contests, where victors were often crowned with olive wreaths and anointed with precious oil. Think of it. Every time an Athenian lit a lamp, prepared a meal, or celebrated a hero, they were subtly, unconsciously, acknowledging Athena's enduring gift. Historically, the olive industry was a cornerstone of the Athenian economy, driving trade and fostering prosperity. The export of olive oil was a major source of wealth, allowing Athens to fund its impressive public works and intellectual pursuits. One quirky tidbit is that in ancient Athens, it was illegal to cut down an olive tree, even on private land, unless specific permission was granted, reflecting its sacred status and economic importance. Historians still argue whether the economic boom from olive oil directly contributed to the rise of Athenian democracy, by empowering a broader segment of the population through trade and agriculture. The olive tree's symbolism extended beyond the purely practical. It was associated with peace, perhaps because its cultivation required patience and harmony, unlike the often destructive nature of war. It also became a potent symbol of wisdom and intellect, embodying the steady, enduring growth that comes from careful thought and cultivation, mirroring Athena's own qualities. When philosophers sat under the shade of an olive tree, debating the nature of reality, it wasn't just a convenient spot. It was an environment steeped in the very essence of their patron goddess's gift. You can picture the generations passing, children growing up with the sight and scent of olive trees as a constant backdrop to their lives. They would learn to tend the groves, to press the oil, to appreciate the simple, profound generosity of the earth, guided by their wise goddess. The olive tree was a quiet monument, more impactful than any grand statue, because it touched every aspect of daily life, silently yet powerfully reinforcing the values of prudence, patience, and sustained effort. It was a stark contrast to the fleeting spectacle of Poseidon's salty spring, a constant reminder that the most valuable gifts are often those that require thoughtful engagement and offer enduring benefit, rather than just immediate flash. The legacy of Athena's quiet triumph was literally rooted in the landscape, a testament to her far-sighted wisdom. Even as we recline here, perhaps listening to the gentle hum of a fan, you might wonder how a dusty old myth about a tree and some salty water could possibly hold any relevance today. Yet, the echoes of Athena's quiet triumph and the enduring legacy of the olive tree reverberate through our modern world in ways you might not even realize. It's not just about a plant anymore. It's about the values it came to represent, values that are still surprisingly potent. Consider the Mediterranean diet, lauded globally for its health benefits. What's one of its absolute cornerstones? Olive oil, of course. That golden liquid, flowing from the very same kind of trees that Athena gifted, is a daily staple for millions, linking modern culinary trends back to an ancient divine offering. You probably have a bottle in your kitchen right now, perhaps even an extra virgin one. A term that speaks to careful cultivation and quality, qualities Athena herself embodied. Beyond the dinner table, the olive branch remains a universal symbol of peace. When nations seek to resolve conflicts, they extend an olive branch. This isn't just a random botanical choice. It's a direct callback to the enduring message of Athena's gift, a message of harmony, negotiation, and the cultivation of lasting solutions over destructive force. From peace treaties to international organizations, the symbolism of the olive branch is omnipresent, quietly reminding us of its ancient origins. Historically, the spread of Greek culture and philosophy often carried with it the symbolism of the olive tree, influencing Roman art, literature, and later, even early Christian iconography. One quirky tidbit is that the Olympic Games, one of the most enduring legacies of ancient Greece, initially awarded olive wreaths, known as kotinos, to victors, not medals, further cementing the tree's association with achievement and honor. Historians still argue whether the universal adoption of the olive branch as a symbol of peace truly stems directly from the Athena-Poseidon myth, or if it evolved independently from broader agricultural and cultural practices across the Mediterranean. Think about the concept of sustainable agriculture, a pressing concern in our contemporary world. Athena's olive tree wasn't about instant gratification. It was about long-term yield, about a resource that would sustain generations with careful stewardship. This ancient myth, in its quiet way, offers a timeless lesson about looking beyond immediate desires to cultivate resources that endure, a message that resonates deeply with modern environmental movements. It's a reminder that true wealth often comes from patient cultivation, not from sudden, flashy discoveries or exploitations. So, the next time you drizzle olive oil on your salad, or see an image of an olive branch, take a moment. You're not just encountering a foodstuff or a symbol. You're touching a direct, living link to a millennia-old story. You're witnessing the quiet power of wisdom, foresight, and utility, still at play in our world. A gentle ripple from a time when gods walked the earth and chose patrons for cities based on what truly served the people, not just what looked most impressive. The boring myth, it turns out, is deeply, subtly relevant, weaving its ancient threads through the very fabric of our daily lives. You might be forgiven for thinking that a story about a salty spring and an olive tree is, well, a bit dull, especially when compared to tales of cyclopes, hydras, and heroes with impossible strength. But that's precisely why this boring victory of Athena's holds such profound, often overlooked, significance. It challenges our conventional notions of what constitutes a win, especially in the realm of myths where bombast and spectacle usually reign supreme. Most Greek myths are full of gods demonstrating their overwhelming power. Zeus with his lightning bolts, Poseidon with his earthquakes, Apollo with his deadly arrows. These are dramatic, awe-inspiring displays of raw might. Yet, here, Athena secures her victory not through force, not through intimidation, but through a quiet act of foresight and practical wisdom. She didn't need to lift a finger in anger, or even raise her voice in triumph. Her weapon was a simple branch. Her strategy was an understanding of basic human needs. This highlights a crucial lesson often overshadowed by the more sensational tales: the immense power of utility. What is truly valuable isn't always what's most flashy or immediately impressive. A gushing spring of undrinkable water might look amazing, but it's utterly useless. A humble tree, however, providing sustenance, light, and trade for centuries, proves to be the far superior gift. It's the difference between a high-tech gadget with a million features you'll never use and a perfectly crafted tool that does one thing exceptionally well, day in and day out. Historically, this myth might be seen as reflecting a societal shift in emphasis from raw, untamed nature, personified by Poseidon, to the ordered, cultivated aspects of civilization, represented by Athena. It speaks to the human ingenuity in harnessing resources rather than simply being at the mercy of the elements. One quirky tidbit is that while Athena won the official patronage, Poseidon was still heavily worshipped in coastal areas of Attica, a testament to the practical necessity of appeasing the sea god for maritime safety, even if he wasn't the primary city patron. Historians still argue whether the perceived boringness of Athena's victory makes it a more realistic depiction of ancient decision-making, or simply less appealing to later generations seeking grander narratives. Athena's victory wasn't about dominating her opponent. It was about serving the people. She understood that true power, the kind that endures and builds, comes from providing genuine benefit, from addressing fundamental needs with intelligent solutions. It's a lesson that still applies today, whether you're designing a product, planning a community, or even just deciding what to have for dinner. The most impactful choices are often the ones that are practical, sustainable, and truly useful, rather than merely dazzling. So, this seemingly uneventful myth isn't boring because it lacks drama, but because its drama is internal, intellectual, rather than external and explosive. It's the drama of foresight, of strategic thinking, of understanding true value. And that, in itself, is a profound and often overlooked form of power, one that shaped not just a city, but the very ideals of a civilization. Delving deeper into this ostensibly boring myth reveals layers of subtle lessons, far beyond the simple narrative of a contest between two deities. It's not just a story about how Athens got its name. It's a foundational tale about the very essence of human endeavor, resourcefulness, and foresight. You might even find yourself pondering these concepts as you drift off, their quiet truths settling gently into your consciousness. The first profound lesson lies in resourcefulness. Poseidon, with all his immense power, essentially offered what was already abundant: seawater. He didn't innovate. He merely amplified what was already there, albeit in a spectacularly unhelpful way. Athena, on the other hand, presented a gift that required interaction, cultivation, and ingenuity to truly unlock its potential. An olive tree demands care. It needs planting, pruning, harvesting, and processing. It teaches humanity to work with nature, to transform raw potential into sustained value. This isn't about instant gratification. It's about investing effort for long-term reward. Think of it as the ancient Greek equivalent of teaching someone to fish versus just handing them a dead fish. Then there's the lesson of foresight. Athena looked beyond the immediate thirst or the impressive display of power. She saw the bigger picture: the need for food security, economic stability through trade, and a source of light for learning and craft. Her gift was a symbol of sustained civilization, a foundation upon which a complex society could be built. Poseidon, perhaps blinded by his own might, thought only of the immediate, overwhelming splash. This difference in perspective, short-term dazzle versus long-term sustainability, is a timeless theme, one that continues to challenge decision-makers in every era. Historically, the development of sophisticated agricultural practices and trade networks was crucial for the growth of complex societies in ancient Greece. The olive tree facilitated both. One quirky tidbit is that early Athenian laws, attributed to figures like Solon, placed great emphasis on protecting agricultural land and promoting olive cultivation, directly reflecting the values instilled by this foundational myth. Historians still argue whether the myth itself encouraged these pragmatic developments or if it was crafted to reflect existing societal values and economic realities in Athens. The myth also subtly champions interdependence. While Athena provided the tree, its full benefits could only be realized through human effort and cooperation. The tending of groves, the pressing of oil, the trade of goods, these activities fostered community and collaboration. Poseidon's gift, while powerful, was a singular, self-contained act. Athena's gift invited participation, making the city a partner in its own prosperity, not just a passive recipient of divine benevolence. So, as you can see, this simple tale is far from boring. It's a foundational text for understanding the values that shaped one of history's most influential civilizations. It whispers to us about the importance of practical solutions over grand gestures, of patient cultivation over impulsive acts, and of a wisdom that understands true value lies in what endures and sustains, rather than what merely impresses. These are the quiet truths that, like the olive tree itself, have deep roots and continue to bear fruit, millennia later. This myth serves as a fascinating counterpoint to many other grand narratives of divine power. You see, when we typically think of Greek gods asserting their dominance, we picture thunderbolts, earthquakes, or dramatic floods. Their power is often portrayed as overwhelming, irresistible, and sometimes, frankly, a bit destructive. Yet, in this particular contest, the victory goes not to the god of immense, raw force, but to the goddess who champions something far more unassuming: utility. It's a subtle but powerful argument for the value of practicality over ostentation. Poseidon's gift was an impressive spectacle, a divine fireworks display. It was designed to awe and intimidate, but in the end, it failed the simple test of usefulness. What good is a magnificent gush of water if it's too salty to drink or irrigate crops? It's like building a solid gold bridge that's too heavy to actually cross. Impressive to look at, but functionally useless. Athena, on the other hand, offered a gift that wasn't about flash or immediate impact. The olive tree is not a creature of immediate grandeur. It takes years to mature and bear fruit, and its benefits unfold gradually over time. But those benefits are profound and multifaceted. It provides sustenance, fuel, wealth through trade, and a symbol of peace. It's the ultimate example of understated efficiency, a quiet workhorse compared to Poseidon's show pony. Historically, the preference for practical solutions over purely aesthetic or symbolic ones became a hallmark of Athenian thought, particularly in their approach to governance and public works. While they built magnificent temples, their infrastructure, like aqueducts and efficient harbors, reflected a deep understanding of utility. One quirky tidbit is that even the Athenian navy, which became immensely powerful, was built on practical shipbuilding techniques and strategic deployment, rather than relying on mythical interventions. Historians still argue whether this mythical narrative subtly reflects an existing cultural preference for pragmatism in Athenian society, or if the myth itself helped to cultivate such a value. This tale quietly whispers that true power isn't about being able to shake the earth. It's about being able to sustain life, to provide for the fundamental needs of a populace. It's about building something that lasts, something that genuinely improves the quality of daily existence. The wisdom here isn't in wielding immense force, but in understanding what is truly needed and providing it in the most effective, enduring way. So, while other myths glorify strength and dramatic intervention, the story of Athena's victory in the pottery contest, which, let's be honest, was far more mundane than any pottery contest you'd see today, celebrates a different kind of strength. The strength of foresight, the power of thoughtful contribution, and the enduring value of practical solutions. It teaches us that sometimes, the most profound victories are won not with a bang, but with a quiet, persistent rustle of leaves, providing sustenance and light for generations to come.